I hadn't stepped into the Plaza Hotel in almost 10 years. But that night, the air felt thick with perfume, piano music, and the kind of laughter that hides judgment behind champagne bubbles. My heels clicked against the marble as I walked into the ballroom, every sound echoing like a memory I never asked to relive. Hundreds of faces turned toward me, and for a moment, it felt as if the past had followed me here, dressed in sequins and secrets. That was when I saw him, Ethan Clark. Perfect suit, easy smile. The man my cousin was about to marry. He looked familiar in a way that twisted my stomach before my brain caught up. His hand was resting lightly on Olivia's waist, the same hand that, just last week, had signed a quarterly report addressed to me. The realization hit like a glass shattering in slow motion. My cousin's fiancé worked for me. He hadn't noticed me yet. Why would he? I was just another guest in a room of perfect people. Until he did notice, his gaze flickered, then froze. His polite expression cracked, confusion bleeding into recognition. "Do you two know each other?" Olivia asked, tilting her head in that rehearsed way she always used when she wanted attention. Ethan hesitated. "I think we might have met before," he said, his voice suddenly cautious. I smiled, the kind of smile that hides everything you're dying to say. "Oh, we've definitely met." His eyes widened. He remembered now. My name, my title. The emails with my signature at the bottom. Maya Bennett, Managing Partner, Stonebridge Capital. The same Stonebridge that had quietly acquired North River Financial, his company, just 6 months earlier. The same Maya who'd sat in that acquisition meeting, watching a room full of men explain how they'd lost control of the numbers. And now, the fiancé of the cousin who'd called me the ugly dropout was standing there realizing I was his boss. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. Because this isn't just a story about family or revenge. It's about what happens when the girl you laughed at builds an empire and then walks straight back into the room where you buried her. Olivia's voice sliced through the tension like the clinking of crystal. "Maya, darling, I didn't think you'd actually come. Everyone, this is my cousin, the one who dropped out of Columbia to find herself." The word dropped out landed between us like a curse. Her laugh was light, but her eyes were sharp. Same old Olivia, beautiful, flawless, and utterly blind to her own cruelty. I'd expected this moment. I'd practiced how I'd handle it, but nothing could prepare me for the strange quiet that followed. People turned. Someone whispered my name, and then Ethan's hand slipped from Olivia's waist. He was pale now. The realization was complete. He knew who I was, and more importantly, he knew who I had become. "Stonebridge Capital," he murmured under his breath, as if saying it out loud might change reality. Olivia frowned. "What?" "Nothing," he said quickly, forcing a smile. "I just wasn't expecting you to be that Maya Bennett." Her laughter tinkled again. "Oh, she's full of surprises. Always has been. Remember when she used to babysit me? She once burned a batch of cookies so badly the kitchen smelled for a week." I wanted to laugh. If only she knew what kind of fire I'd been tending since then. My heart pounded, but not from nerves. It was power, a quiet, measured thrum that came from surviving every storm they said would drown me. I had walked into this ballroom expecting discomfort, maybe a little pain. What I didn't expect was how intoxicating it would feel to stand here, face to face with the people who had once erased me. The chandeliers glittered like 1,000 tiny witnesses. Olivia was still talking, something about wedding colors and floral arrangements, her voice fading into background noise. I looked past her, past the polished perfection, and found my reflection in the window. A woman they'd tried to bury, now standing taller than their expectations could ever reach. The irony wasn't lost on me. 9 years ago, this family had written me off as a failure. I was the ugly cousin, the dropout, the embarrassment. When Grandma Rose got sick, I left college to care for her. They said it was a waste of potential, that I was throwing away my future for sentiment. But Grandma Rose had been the only one who saw something in me worth fighting for. She gave me $50,000, a piece of her garden locket, and the kind of advice that changes lives. When people misprice you, don't beg them to see your value. Build something they can't ignore. So I did. I built it piece by piece, deal by deal, loss by loss. I turned their silence into strategy, their laughter into motivation. And tonight, standing under chandeliers worth more than my first year's revenue, I finally understood this wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. Ethan cleared his throat, still visibly unsettled. I didn't realize you and Olivia were related. I met his gaze. Small world, isn't it? Olivia giggled. Oblivious? Tiny. Practically microscopic. But Ethan wasn't laughing anymore. He was staring at me like a man realizing the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. Somewhere in the corner, a violinist shifted into a minor key. The music felt heavier now, the air thicker. For a fleeting second, I almost pitied him. Almost. Because he didn't know what was coming next, the subtle unraveling of the evening, the whispers, the dawning horror that would creep across this room like spilled wine. He didn't know that before the night was over, he'd see me for who I truly was. Not the girl they dismissed, but the woman they'd have to reckon with. I took a sip of champagne, its bubbles sharp against my tongue, and smiled at him one last time. Congratulations, by the way, I said softly. You've made quite the match. His eyes darted toward Olivia, then back to me. Yeah, he said, voice low. So have you. The music swelled. Someone laughed too loudly. And in that moment, surrounded by everything that used to make me feel small, I realized something profound. The best revenge isn't anger, it's composure. I turned to walk toward the bar, my heels echoing across the marble like punctuation marks at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. That was the night my past met my present and learned it no longer had power. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what happened next would turn that glittering party into the reckoning they never saw coming. And before we dive into the rest of it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep creating stories that stay with you long after they end. Now, a quick question for you before we move on. If you were in Maya's place that night, what would you do? A, smile and stay silent, letting your success speak for itself. B, call them out publicly and make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. Comment your answer, A or B, below. I'm curious which side you'd be on. When people tell the story of my family, they never mention the quiet parts, the late nights, the silence after slammed doors, the way disappointment can sound like love if you're desperate enough to hear it that way. For years, I tried to fit into their definition of success, checking boxes that weren't mine. The Ivy League degree, the perfect GPA, the internship that was supposed to lead to a corner office. I thought if I played by their rules long enough, I'd earn their respect. But respect never came. I was 22 when my grandmother Rose fell ill. Her lungs had begun to betray her, soft and fragile as tissue paper. The doctors said it would be months, maybe less. My parents, who measured affection and achievements, suggested that nurses could handle it. I remember the conversation like a bruise you press just to see if it still hurts. My father looked up from his laptop and said, "You'll ruin your life if you drop out now." My mother didn't even look up at all, but Rose had been the only one who ever saw me. When I was a little girl, she'd pull me into her garden, away from the noise, and tell me stories about resilience, about women who built empires out of scraps, who learned to bloom in rocky soil. "You have that in you, Maya," she used to say, her hands smelling like mint and soil. "You just have to stop asking for permission." So I packed my things, left Columbia University halfway through my senior year, and moved into her apartment in Washington Heights. It wasn't glamorous, peeling wallpaper, cracked tiles, and the faint hum of the city that never sleeps, but it was real. It was ours. I learned how to measure time, not in semesters, but in medication schedules, oxygen tanks, and the rhythm of her breathing. My family stopped calling after the first month. My cousins went on with their perfect lives. My parents sent a Christmas card that year without a return address. I learned the kind of loneliness that doesn't cry. It just sits beside you, patient and heavy. But in that silence, something else started growing. Rose didn't just leave me memories. She left me her wisdom. Even as her body weakened, her mind stayed sharp. We spent evenings watching the sunset over the Hudson, her hand cold in mine. She'd talk about the depression, about saving every dime, about how worth was something you built, not something you were given. One night, as the light faded, she said, "Don't let them define your value, sweetheart. People will always misprice you when they can't profit from your shine." She died 2 weeks later. The day after the funeral, I found an envelope in her bedside drawer, my name written in her trembling cursive. Inside were a few old photographs, a recipe card stained with time, and a check for $50,000. Her final gift. Her final challenge. I could almost hear her voice whispering, "Build something, Maya. Something that's yours." I stood in that small apartment surrounded by empty oxygen tanks and fading flowers and realized I had nothing left but potential and pain. I didn't know where to start, but I knew I couldn't go back. Returning home would mean admitting they were right, that I'd wasted my life. So instead, I decided to rewrite the definition of worth. Those first years were brutal. I worked at a tiny cafe near 181st Street, brewing coffee for people who reminded me of everything I'd lost. I rented a room the size of a closet, where the radiator never worked, and the neighbors fought like their words could break walls. At night, I'd go to the public library, scrolling through job postings and free online business courses, teaching myself financial modeling, Excel formulas, marketing strategy, anything that could give me a way out. I was invisible to my family, but the city noticed me in small ways. A cafe regular who ran a local bakery asked me to help organize her invoices. She paid me $50 in cash and a free slice of pie. I spent nights at my laptop, cleaning spreadsheets, catching mistakes, finding patterns. It wasn't much, but it was something. Soon, word spread. One client became 3. I wasn't making real money yet, but I was making traction. I started printing business cards on cheap paper that curled at the edges. Bennett Consulting, making order out of chaos. I didn't realize it then, but that motto was also a blueprint for my life. I'd like to say I was fearless, but that would be a lie. There were nights I cried until my chest hurt, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Nights I'd check my phone for messages that never came. But every time I thought about quitting, I saw Rose's handwriting in my mind, shaky but certain, and I'd keep going. I remember one particular winter. My bank account balance was down to $217. The cafe had cut my shifts and the radiator had given up completely. I wore 2 coats indoors, working under a blanket with gloves that had holes in the fingertips so I could still type. I was exhausted, hungry, and furious at the universe for being so indifferent. Then, in the middle of one of those endless nights, I got an email from a small logistics company in the Bronx. They'd heard about me through a friend of a friend. Their finances were a mess, their systems outdated, their morale worse. I said yes before I even asked about the pay. It turned out to be the project that saved me. 3 months later, their profits had stabilized, their books were clean, and I'd earned more than I'd ever seen in one payment. I used that check to buy a refurbished laptop, a secondhand blazer, and a little courage. That was the start of the climb I didn't yet recognize as one. But back then, I was just trying to survive. And survival, I learned, is an underrated art form. It teaches you to listen differently, to notice the people who hold the door open when they don't have to measure success not in applause, but in momentum. It teaches you to keep your heart kind, even when the world pretends not to see you. What I didn't know then was that all those nights alone at my desk, all those little projects no one cared about, were quietly building something stronger than validation. They were building competence, independence, power. Years later, when the money came, when the offices expanded and the contracts turned 7 digits, people would call it luck. But luck is just the name people give to work they didn't see. Back then, I didn't have luxury handbags or boardroom seats. I had instant noodles, sticky notes on my walls, and faith that tomorrow might be half an inch better than today. I had Rose's voice reminding me that no one's opinion could bankrupt me unless I gave them access to my spirit. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I'd walk past Columbia's campus. I'd watch students rushing between classes, snow in their hair, ambition in their eyes, and I'd feel that ache of what might have been. But it always passed. Because somewhere deep down, I knew that my education hadn't stopped. It had just changed subjects. I was no longer studying theory. I was learning endurance. When I finally let go of needing their approval, I found something better than validation. Purpose. The kind that grows in the cracks, the kind that doesn't need permission to exist. That was my fall from grace, or at least that's what they called it. But I've learned that sometimes grace isn't about staying on your feet. Sometimes it's about learning to rise, over and over again, until falling no longer scares you. And so the girl they called the Dropout kept walking, quietly, stubbornly, toward a future that didn't need their applause. Success never happens with a drum roll. It begins in silence, in rooms no one visits, at desks lit by cheap lamps that buzz louder than your own self-belief. For me, it started with that first check from the Bronx logistics firm, a win that bought time, not comfort. I thought once the project ended, doors would fly open. Instead, I found myself staring at an inbox full of polite rejections and a city that didn't even notice I existed. But there's a strange freedom in invisibility. When no one's watching, you can experiment, fail, and build again without an audience. I kept my cafe job for stability, even though it bruised my pride to serve lattes to people in suits I used to envy. Every afternoon, I'd slip away to meet clients in diners, subways, or sometimes on park benches. I learned to negotiate over background noise, the hiss of espresso machines, the cry of sirens, and discovered that real business happens anywhere someone trusts you to solve their problem. I rented a co-working desk downtown, just one in a sea of dreamers. I still remember the smell of burnt coffee and ambition in that shared space. My desk was wedged between a startup selling dog vitamins and a freelance UX designer who sang to his plants. I worked 14 hours a day and slept on the couch during winter storms because the train stopped running. The cleaning staff would shake their heads and joke, "You again?" I'd smile, pretending I wasn't terrified that the whole fragile thing could collapse at any moment. There were seasons when failure became familiar company. A potential investor ghosted me 2 days before signing. A client refused to pay because we're friends. Taxes ate half my savings. I learned more about grit from those months than any seminar could have taught me. Every setback hardened something in me, but it didn't make me cruel. It made me precise. Somewhere in that haze, a new version of Maya Bennett began to emerge. Someone who stopped waiting for permission. I stopped chasing every opportunity and started choosing. Instead of calling myself a consultant, I began to call myself a strategist. Words matter. They shape how the world sees you and how you see yourself. I rewrote my pitch deck, updated my website, and tripled my prices overnight. I lost half my clients, but doubled my income. That was the first time I understood the quiet power of saying no. It was also when I met Leo, a retired CFO who'd spent 40 years turning failing companies into success stories. We met at a networking event I almost skipped because I couldn't afford the ticket. He was standing near the buffet table, wearing a suit that had seen better decades, his tie slightly crooked. "You look like you hate these things," he said, handing me a plate. I laughed, maybe for the first time in months. We talked for hours. He became my mentor, my compass in a world that measured worth by quarterly growth charts. Leo didn't just teach me numbers, he taught me how to see them as a language. "Every spreadsheet tells a story," he'd say. "Your job is to translate chaos into clarity." Under his guidance, I began to see patterns others missed. The way inefficiency hides in habits, the way leadership falters when people stop listening. I started helping small businesses rebuild not just their finances, but their confidence. By year 3, Bennett Consulting was no longer a one-woman operation. I hired my first employee, a part-time assistant named Camila, who balanced community college and a 2-hour commute. She reminded me of myself, tired but hopeful. We worked side by side in that same noisy co-working space, sharing a single heater in the winter and dreams bigger than our rent. We celebrated every new contract with dollar slice pizza. That's when I launched my first real initiative, the Rose Fellowship. Named after Grandma Rose, it offered paid apprenticeships for women re-entering the workforce. Single mothers, survivors, caregivers who'd stepped away from careers to hold their families together. I wanted to build what I never had, a place where potential wasn't dismissed because of circumstance. Our first fellow, Tanya, had been out of the workforce for 7 years after caring for her sick son. Within 6 months, she was leading client accounts. Watching her sign her first lease made me prouder than any profit margin. The fellowship drew attention. A local newspaper wrote a feature calling me the Dropout Who Rebuilt. The headline stung, but the article brought a flood of new inquiries. Suddenly, I was juggling more work than I could handle. I moved out of the co-working space into a tiny office on Madison Avenue. Bare walls, mismatched furniture, a window view of another building's brick wall. It was perfect. I still lived frugally, use subway passes instead of Ubers, thrift store blazers instead of designer suits. But there was dignity in that restraint. Every dollar went back into the company. I started saving for something bigger, something that could change my trajectory completely. An acquisition. Not for status, but for scale. I wanted a firm that already had infrastructure, reputation, and clients I could grow. When I told Leo my plan, he smiled like a man who'd been waiting to hear those words. You've been playing defense long enough, Maya. Time to take the field. We spent nights running valuations, reviewing balance sheets, analyzing industries. That's when North River Financial appeared on my radar, a respected but crumbling mid-size investment firm drowning in its own complacency. Their books told a story of missed opportunities and shrinking margins. But beneath the mess, I saw potential. Loyal employees, decades of brand equity, and a client base desperate for new energy. I spent 6 months preparing my proposal. It was the biggest risk of my life. If it failed, I'd lose everything I'd built. But when the deal finally closed and the ink dried on the acquisition papers, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just a consultant anymore. I was an owner. People started calling me a success story. They didn't see the unpaid invoices, the sleepless nights, the self-doubt that sat on my chest like an anvil. They saw headlines and LinkedIn posts. But success isn't a moment. It's an accumulation of quiet endurance. Even with money in the bank, I didn't stop working 18-hour days. I wanted North River to become more than a turnaround story. I wanted it to be proof that empathy and efficiency could coexist. I restructured departments, promoted talent that had been ignored, implemented paid family leave, and created a mentorship track for first-generation professionals. Within a year, profits doubled and culture transformed. One evening, after signing a new partnership deal, I stood by the window of my new office overlooking the East River. The city shimmered below, and for the first time in years, I felt something like peace. I thought of Rose, of her cracked hands, her steady voice. I whispered, "We made it." Not as a victory chant, but as a promise kept. The climb had cost me everything: sleep, relationships, even the illusion of ease. But it had given me something rarer: ownership of my own narrative. I'd built a life from the ruins they left me in, a life no one could take credit for but me. And yet, despite all the milestones, part of me still carried that lonely girl from Washington Heights. She lived quietly inside me, reminding me never to confuse comfort with purpose. So I kept building, not out of revenge, but out of devotion. To her, to Rose, to every woman who'd ever been underestimated. By the time the invitation to Olivia's engagement party arrived, the world saw me as unshakable. But what they didn't know was that beneath the polish and power, I was still that girl with ink on her hands, piecing together a dream from broken glass. The climb wasn't glamorous. It was grit dressed in grace. And it was only just beginning. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, buried beneath contracts and quarterly reports, its envelope thick and ivory like it carried something sacred. My assistant, Camila, handed it to me with a raised brow. "It looks fancy," she said. She was right. It was the kind of envelope that smelled like old money and approval. Embossed with silver lettering, "Olivia Hart and Ethan Clark cordially invite you to celebrate their engagement at the Plaza Hotel, New York City." I stared at it longer than I meant to. My cousin's name shimmered under the light, each curve of ink both familiar and foreign. Olivia, the golden one, the family's pride, the woman who'd never stumbled. The same cousin who, 9 years earlier, had told her friends I dropped out to play nurse and ruined my life. I should have tossed it in the trash. The Maya Bennett of a decade ago probably would have. But the woman reading that invitation now wasn't the same. It had been years since I'd heard from any of them. Birthdays passed in silence, holidays unacknowledged. When Grandma Rose died, they sent flowers, but didn't come to the funeral. I told myself I didn't care, that I'd made peace with the distance. But that embossed card proved otherwise. It reminded me that even after all the success, part of me still longed to be seen, not for validation, but for closure. Camila interrupted my thoughts. "Are you going?" "I don't know yet," I said. But the truth was forming quietly in the back of my mind. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat on my terrace overlooking the city. The skyline glittered like possibility, but beneath the lights I felt something raw stirring, a mix of curiosity, defiance, and a strange sense of destiny. There are moments when life offers you a stage, and even if you never asked for one, you feel the pull to step into the light. It wasn't about revenge. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I'd already built the kind of success that couldn't be denied. But there's a power in showing up where you were once unwelcome, in standing before the people who buried your name and watching them realize the ghosts they ignored learned how to live beautifully without them. I thought about Grandma Rose, about her steady voice whispering, "Show them what you're worth." She hadn't meant it in the vengeful sense. She'd meant, "Don't hide your light because others are uncomfortable with it." I'd spent years internalizing that truth, quietly, privately. Maybe now it was time to embody it publicly. The next morning, I took the envelope from my desk drawer and ran my fingers over the engraved letters one last time before tearing it open. Inside was a card written in Olivia's looping handwriting. "We hope to see you there. It's been too long." There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a casual assumption that I'd forgotten everything that came before. It was so perfectly her, graceful on the surface, dismissive underneath. I took a breath and clicked RSVP, accept. It felt like closing one chapter and opening another. Preparing for the event became a quiet ritual of reclamation. I didn't tell anyone why it mattered. To everyone else, it was just another evening, another social obligation. But to me, it was a pilgrimage, a return to the scene of my undoing. I booked an appointment at a small, private salon in Soho that smelled of citrus and serenity. The stylist, an older woman with kind eyes, brushed my hair with care usually reserved for broken things. "Big night?" she asked. "Something like that," I said, smiling. Afterward, I wandered into a boutique near the West Village. Rows of dresses glittered beneath soft lighting. I wasn't looking for luxury, I was looking for symbolism. Then I saw it, a simple black gown, elegant but understated, with a backline that whispered confidence, not arrogance. I tried it on. It fit as if it had been waiting for me. In the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The woman staring back didn't look like someone who'd once cried herself to sleep over family disapproval. She looked like someone who had learned how to alchemize pain into purpose. That realization didn't make me proud. It made me peaceful. On the day of the party, I stood in my apartment by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city pulse below. I thought about all the versions of me who'd survived to reach this point. The girl who dropped out of Columbia, the woman who built a business from nothing, the professional who signed million-dollar contracts and mentored women who'd once been overlooked. They had all carried me here. I wasn't attending this event as a wounded relative returning for recognition. I was attending as a woman complete in herself. Still, beneath the calm, there was a flicker of nerves, not fear of confrontation, but fear of exposure. Would walking into that ballroom feel like victory or vulnerability? I wasn't sure. But one thing I did know, I wouldn't let their past opinions dictate my present truth. I called Camila before leaving. "If I don't come back," I joked, "burn the company down." She laughed. "You'll come back with fireworks, not ashes." The car ride to the plaza was surreal. New York shimmered around me, familiar and foreign all at once. The closer I got, the more memories surfaced. The last family dinner I attended, the awkward silence when I mentioned Grandma's illness, the way my mother's eyes slid away like looking at me was a mirror she didn't want to face. I thought I'd buried all of that. But trauma has its own geography. It maps itself into you quietly, waiting for the right coordinates to resurface. When the car pulled up to the hotel entrance, the doorman greeted me like any other guest. "Welcome to the plaza, ma'am." Inside, the lobby glowed in gold and marble. I could almost hear Grandma Rose's laugh. "Don't slouch, sweetheart. Walk like you own the place." I straightened my back and walked in. There's a myth that power feels loud. In truth, it feels still. Like knowing the weight of your silence can fill a room louder than any speech. In the elevator, I caught my reflection once more. The black dress, the calm expression, the steady breath. I thought about how far I'd come, about the people who helped me climb and the ones who pushed me down. Both had shaped me. Both deserve gratitude. When the doors opened, I stepped into a hallway lined with chandeliers, the faint hum of laughter spilling from the ballroom ahead. My heart beat steady, not in anticipation, but in acknowledgement. This was the full circle moment I hadn't known I needed. Before walking in, I took out my phone and opened my notes app. At the top, I typed a single line. You are not here to prove them wrong. You are here to prove yourself right. Then I put the phone away, lifted my chin, and entered the light. The moment I crossed that threshold, the air shifted. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. I felt hundreds of eyes scan me, trying to reconcile memory with presence. Some recognized me immediately. Others looked as if they'd seen a ghost. But I just smiled, a soft, knowing curve of the lips that said everything without needing words. That night wasn't about revenge or confrontation. It was about presence, the kind that doesn't demand attention, it earns it. I walked into that ballroom, not as the family dropout, not as the cautionary tale, but as a living contradiction to their predictions. The woman they dismissed had come home, not seeking their approval, but her own closure. And in that moment, standing beneath the glittering chandeliers of the plaza, I realized something profound. Sometimes life invites you back, not to reopen old wounds, but to show you that you've healed. The first thing that hit me was the noise, the effortless laughter, the clinking of champagne flutes, the orchestra's polished cheer. The ballroom of the plaza glittered like an overpolished memory, full of the same faces I'd once known, each one slightly older, slightly harder. I stood near the entrance, taking in the crowd, letting my gaze move over the scene like a silent camera. There were my aunts in sequined gowns, my uncles comparing stock portfolios, cousins with curated smiles. I'd imagined this moment a dozen times, and yet, standing here, I realized the real power wasn't in being noticed. It was in knowing I no longer needed to be. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne. I took one glass, not to celebrate, but to anchor myself, to have something steady to hold. From across the room, I spotted Olivia surrounded by admirers, her laughter bright and practiced. The years had been kind to her. They always were to people who'd never known consequence. Her fiancé, Ethan Clark, stood beside her in a tailored navy suit, smiling that easy corporate smile I'd seen in meetings, the kind that could charm a boardroom or deflect accountability. He looked different here, though, younger, softer, unaware that tonight would shift something in him he couldn't undo. When Olivia saw me, it took her a heartbeat too long to react. I watched the flicker of recognition, the hesitation, the recalibration of her expression. Her lips parted in surprise, then curved into that same dismissive grin I'd known since childhood. Maya, I can't believe you came. She reached out, air kissing the space near my cheek. You look different. Different. The polite euphemism for unrecognizable, for unexpected. It's been a while, I said, matching her tone, my smile smooth as glass. She laughed lightly. Too long, everyone. This is my cousin Maya, the one who left Columbia to take care of Grandma Rose. Remember? Such a sweetheart. Her voice was sweet enough to rot the air, each word dipped in sugar and superiority. Around us, polite smiles appeared, the kind people use when they're not sure what side of history they're standing on. I could almost feel the whispers forming, like the beginning of a storm. Ethan turned, offering his hand with cautious politeness. We've actually met, he said. There was a faint tremor in his voice, almost imperceptible. I didn't realize you and Olivia were related. I get that a lot, I replied. Our handshake was brief, but heavy with unspoken truth. I saw the calculation flicker behind his eyes, the mental sorting of facts, emails, contracts, executive memos, all converging into one unavoidable realization. His fiancé's cousin was his boss. Olivia tilted her head. Oh, you've met? Small world, huh? She said it like a joke, blissfully unaware of how true it really was. Ethan's jaw tightened. Very small, he murmured. She moved on quickly, introducing me to a circle of guests as though I were some charity project she was proud to display. This is Maya. She's doing consulting, right? I smiled because I'd learned long ago that silence is often the sharpest blade. Yes, something like that. Her friends nodded, their polite curiosity evaporating when they realized I wasn't going to justify my presence with self-deprecation. They turned the conversation back to weddings, travel plans, and how exhausting it was to maintain their lives of comfort. Ethan lingered beside me, trying to appear casual. You really own Stonebridge Capital? He asked under his breath. Among other things, I said softly, my gaze fixed on Olivia as she recounted a story that ended with her own laughter. He nodded, his throat working as if swallowing something bitter. I had no idea. When I took the position at North River, I know, I interrupted. You were hired through merit, Ethan. I don't mix family and business. He gave a nervous laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. And yet, here we are. Here we were indeed, on opposite sides of a truth neither of us could unsee. As the evening unfolded, I drifted through conversations with practiced ease. Every exchange was a small performance, warm enough to be polite, distant enough to maintain control. My parents were near the bar, pretending not to watch me. My father's expression was the same stoic mask he'd worn the day I told him I was leaving school. My mother looked brittle, her fingers clenched around a glass of white wine. They didn't approach, and I didn't invite them to. Some distances are better left intact. At one point, Aunt Celia approached with her usual brand of false nostalgia. Maya, darling, we were just talking about you. You've done so well for yourself. I smiled. I've been lucky. She patted my arm, her diamond bracelet catching the light. You know, I always told your mother you'd land on your feet. That was a lie. I remembered every word she'd said when I left college, how irresponsible, how short-sighted, how shameful it was to throw away an education. But I nodded anyway. I wasn't here to win arguments. I was here to witness them reframe their memories around my success. Across the room, Ethan stood rigid beside Olivia. He'd been quiet since our introduction, his smile thinner, his posture tighter. She didn't notice. She was too busy performing. I wondered what he was thinking, whether he was replaying the office rumors, the articles, the stories of Stonebridge's meteoric rise, whether he realized how carefully I'd built the empire he now worked for, brick by brick, in silence. As the band shifted to a slower melody, the crowd thinned toward the dance floor. I excused myself, stepping near the tall windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. The city sprawled beneath me, indifferent and infinite. I took a slow sip of champagne, the bubbles crisp against my tongue. Ethan joined me a moment later, his voice low. You knew, didn't you? About me and Olivia. Of course. And you still hired me. I hired talent, I said, not family connections. He exhaled, the sound half disbelief, half admiration. Does she know? Not yet. He looked at me, eyes narrowing slightly. Are you going to tell her? I don't have to. He fell silent, following my gaze to the window. The reflection of the room shimmered faintly in the glass. Olivia laughing, the crowd adoring, the same old family hierarchy pretending to stand unshaken. You're not what I expected, he said finally. No one ever is, I replied. Behind us, someone called Olivia's name, and she turned, her laughter floating across the room like perfume. Ethan's eyes lingered on her for a long moment before returning to me. There was something like guilt in his expression, but also something like understanding. I should probably get back to her, he said quietly. Of course, I said. Wouldn't want her to think you're networking. He hesitated, then offered a small, rueful smile before walking away. As he rejoined her, I caught the faintest tremor in Olivia's expression, something instinctual, almost primal, as if she sensed a shift she couldn't name. The air between them looked slightly heavier now, the easy rhythm of their performance disrupted. I stayed by the window, letting the scene settle. The truth of the night wasn't about confrontation in the dramatic sense. It was quieter, subtler, the kind of confrontation where you don't have to raise your voice or reveal your cards. Sometimes power is nothing more than standing where you were once told you didn't belong and watching others realize the geography has changed. When I finally turned away from the window, I caught my reflection in the glass again. Not the dropout, not the disappointment, but a woman carved from every rejection she'd ever endured. The music swelled, the crowd glittered, and the night carried on as if nothing monumental had happened. But something had. The balance had shifted, and everyone in that room could feel it, even if they didn't yet understand why. The moment came disguised as something ordinary, a sound so familiar it almost went unnoticed. The delicate chime of glass against glass, the signal for attention, the universal language of gatherings like these. But the second Ethan lifted his champagne flute, the room began to tilt. Conversation slowed, laughter thinned, and I felt the air grow dense around me. I knew, without question, that this was about to become the kind of moment that rewrites family folklore. Excuse me, everyone, Ethan said, his voice carrying through the ballroom with practiced ease. He had the poise of a man used to being listened to, confident in his ability to charm a crowd. Olivia stood beside him, radiant and expectant, clutching his arm with that easy possessiveness of someone who's never had to question her place. Her diamond caught the light, scattering flecks of brilliance across the ceiling. "First," he began, smiling down at her, "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. Olivia and I are so grateful to celebrate with the people who mean the most to us, our families, our friends, and everyone who supported us on this journey." His voice was warm, rehearsed, perfectly bland. Then his gaze shifted, ever so slightly, toward me. I felt it before I saw it, that slow turn of the narrative. The faintest hitch in his words, the pause of a man trying to decide if he was about to make a mistake. "And," he continued, "tonight I learned something surprising about this family I'm so lucky to be joining. Something extraordinary, actually." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Olivia's head tilted in confusion. "Ethan?" she whispered, her smile wavering. He didn't answer her. His eyes stayed fixed on me. "It turns out," he said, "that my fiancé's cousin, the very person I've heard so many stories about, is one of the most brilliant and successful businesswomen in New York." The room stilled. Glasses paused midair. Even the string quartet hesitated on a note. Ethan raised his glass slightly, his expression part admiration, part apology. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing Maya Bennett, founder of Stonebridge Capital and the driving force behind North River Financial's revival. Without her, I wouldn't even have the job that brought me here." For a heartbeat, everything inside me went quiet. Not shock, just the heavy awareness of inevitability. He'd done it. He'd made the private public, exposing the thread I'd tried to keep discreet. I could see what he thought this gesture would do: bridge the awkwardness, prove that he was proud to be associated with me, even elevate himself by association. But he didn't understand what kind of fuse he'd just lit. Olivia's confusion sharpened into something else: disbelief, then dawning horror. Her fingers tightened around his arm. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum of speculation beginning to spread through the crowd. He turned to her, smiling like a man desperate to make sense of chaos. "Your cousin, Maya. She owns the company I work for. She's the reason North River survived last year. Isn't that amazing?" The word "owns" landed like a gunshot muffled by velvet. Heads turned toward me, dozens of faces, familiar and foreign, searching, reassessing, recalculating. My mother's eyes went wide. My father's lips pressed into a thin line. Olivia's perfect composure cracked as she looked from Ethan to me, as if trying to find the punchline to a cruel joke. I hadn't planned to speak, but silence in that moment would have felt like surrender. So I placed my champagne glass on the nearest table and stepped forward. The crowd parted, curiosity moving them aside like a current. "Thank you, Ethan," I said, my voice steady, almost gentle. "That's very kind of you." Olivia's gaze was sharp enough to cut glass. "Wait, you own North River?" "I do," I said. "Controlling interest, full operational authority." The murmur spread louder now. Whispers coiled through the room carrying fragments of disbelief. "Owns the firm? The Dropout? Are you serious?" The music had stopped entirely. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum with tension. Ethan's face drained of color. He hadn't meant to humiliate himself, but that was the thing about truth. It doesn't ask permission before showing its teeth. I turned to face the room. "To clarify," I said, "I didn't just invest in North River. I rebuilt it. It was struggling and I saw potential, something worth saving." I let the words sink in, not boastful, just factual. I had learned the art of quiet authority long ago. And while we're talking about gratitude, I'd like to express mine as well. To everyone who taught me the value of being underestimated, you were my best teachers. There was laughter in the distance. Nervous? Brittle? Olivia's parents exchanged glances that spoke of frantic damage control. My own mother looked as if she'd forgotten how to breathe. I raised my glass, reclaiming the moment completely. "To family," I said softly, my eyes finding Olivia's. "To resilience, and to the quiet ones you thought would never rise." The clink of my glass against crystal was the only sound for several seconds before hesitant applause began. Uneven, awkward, but applause nonetheless. The kind of sound people make when they aren't sure whether to celebrate or fear what just happened. Ethan lowered his glass, his hand trembling slightly. Olivia stood beside him, rigid, her face frozen in a mask of disbelief. The room around us buzzed with whispers. My name, my company. my story spreading faster than I could drink another sip of champagne. I could almost feel the narrative rewriting itself in real time. I caught my father's eye across the room. For once, he didn't look angry. He looked small. My mother's hand clutched his sleeve, her knuckles pale. There was a flicker of something in her face. Regret, maybe, or just the dawning realization that the daughter they'd cast out had become someone they could neither dismiss nor control. As the applause faded, I set my glass down again. "If you'll excuse me," I said softly, "I think I need some air." The terrace was empty, just the hum of the city and the faint echo of my own pulse. Below me, Fifth Avenue stretched like a ribbon of light. I leaned against the railing, letting the cold air wash over me. Behind the glass doors, I could still see the crowd, small clusters forming, phones already out, curiosity ignited. Moments later, the doors opened behind me. Ethan stepped out, his face pale. "Maya," he said quietly, "I didn't mean to." "I know." I didn't turn to face him. "You thought you were doing something kind." "I just wanted to acknowledge you. You deserve it." A humorless laugh escaped me. Acknowledgement isn't always kindness. Sometimes it's exposure. He hesitated, the weight of his mistake dawning on him. "I'm sorry." I finally turned to look at him. "You'll be fine, Ethan. You have a good career ahead of you. Just remember, some truths aren't yours to reveal." He nodded, shame softening his features. Then he went back inside, leaving me alone with the city. For a long moment, I stood there, breathing in the cold air. Inside, they were probably dissecting what had just happened, trying to fit me into a story that made sense to them. But I'd outgrown their narratives. I didn't belong to them anymore. The city lights stretched endlessly, reflecting in the river below. For the first time in years, I felt completely, irrevocably free. I hadn't come here for revenge, but life had a way of offering symmetry. Tonight, I didn't just reclaim my place in the family. I transcended it. Sometimes truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to walk into a room and exist so completely that silence has no choice but to make space for it. The night after the engagement party felt like standing at the edge of a storm that had already passed, quiet, yet heavy with the scent of everything that had just been uprooted. The city outside my apartment window was still awake, neon and alive, indifferent to the wreckage of small human dramas. But I couldn't stop thinking about the looks on their faces. Olivia's disbelief, my mother's silent unraveling, Ethan's pale confusion. It had been a long time since I'd seen truth move through a room like that. Subtle at first, then undeniable, like light spreading through a crack. I set my phone on the kitchen counter. Dozens of missed calls and messages blinked back at me, mostly from numbers I hadn't seen in years. Family members, colleagues, even reporters from a business magazine that must have caught wind of the spectacle. I didn't answer any of them. I wasn't angry. I was simply done. The part of me that once yearned for acknowledgement had nothing left to prove. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. There was no vindictive satisfaction, no triumphant monologue playing in my head. Just an overwhelming sense of clarity, as if some invisible weight had finally lifted. Maybe this was what peace looked like: quiet, steady, and climactic. Not a fireworks show, but the slow clearing of smoke. I walked to my office window and looked down at the river glinting under the moonlight. From this high up, even chaos looked organized. It reminded me that everything eventually found its shape, even broken things. I poured a glass of water and sat on the couch, thinking about what Grandma Rose might have said if she'd seen that night unfold. Probably something simple, something true. "Don't gloat, sweetheart. Grace looks better on you than revenge." The next morning, I was at work by 7. Stonebridge Capital's headquarters was already stirring with life. Assistants balancing coffee trays, analysts rehearsing presentations. My assistant, Camila, walked into my office holding 2 cups of espresso and the look of someone who'd read every headline. "So," she said cautiously, "I take it the party was eventful?" "You could say that," I replied, taking the cup. "I saw the photos online. You trended on Twitter." She tried to hide her grin. I shook my head, amused. There's no such thing as privacy anymore. Her expression softened. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said, and for once, it wasn't a lie. I turned to my computer and opened an email draft I'd been writing in my head all night. It was to HR, copying Lila, our COO. Subject, personnel transition, Ethan Clark. My fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before typing. Transfer to Austin branch, effective immediately. Role, senior financial analyst, green energy portfolio. Frame the move as strategic restructuring. Professional courtesy, no drama. Lila replied within minutes. Understood. Smooth and quiet, as always. I appreciated that about her. She never asked unnecessary questions. We both knew that power wasn't about spectacle, it was about direction. When you lead, you don't shout, you adjust the current. The rest of the day unfolded with its usual rhythm. Meetings, strategy reviews, a call with a philanthropic partner about the new Rosewing project at the hospice in Lower Manhattan. Life moved forward, as it always does. But beneath the surface, something in me had shifted permanently. I no longer carried the ache of wanting my family to see me. I'd shown up, stood tall, and left them to confront their own silence. That chapter was closed. In the following weeks, ripples spread quietly through the family network. Olivia and Ethan's engagement didn't survive the fallout. Rumors circulated, some sympathetic, most speculative. I didn't involve myself. I didn't need to. People have a way of revealing their truths when the illusion of control slips. Olivia's pride had always been her armor, and now that it had cracked, the noise around her grew deafening. She stopped posting her perfect life updates on social media. The wedding hashtags vanished overnight. My parents reached out a few times, cautiously at first, then with increasing urgency. A voicemail from my mother arrived one afternoon while I was in a meeting. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Maya, it's Mom. I want to talk. I didn't realize how much we've missed you. I didn't return the call. Not out of cruelty, but because I needed more than words. Love, to me, had always meant presence, and theirs had been absent when it mattered most. I wished them peace, but I didn't owe them my healing. I poured that energy elsewhere, into the company, into people who saw me not as the family dropout, but as the woman who built something worth believing in. I expanded the Rose Fellowship, doubling its funding to include single fathers and older women re-entering the workforce after caregiving. We launched mentorship programs in partnership with local universities, bridging the gap between potential and opportunity. I spent weekends visiting the fellowship offices, meeting participants, listening to their stories. Their resilience reminded me that growth is not always about climbing, it's about returning to lift others. One evening, months later, I received an email from a name I didn't expect, Ethan Clark. The subject line was a simple thank you. I hesitated before opening it. Maya, it read, I wanted to apologize for how things unfolded. You didn't have to be as gracious as you were, and yet you handled everything with dignity. The Austin transfer turned out to be the best thing for me. I'm leading a sustainability project now. I don't know if I deserved your kindness, but I'll spend my career trying to earn it. E. I read it twice before closing my laptop. It wasn't forgiveness I felt, not exactly. More like acknowledgement that even messy endings can evolve into something decent when handled with restraint. Some lessons can't be taught. They have to be lived. That night, I returned to the terrace with a cup of tea, watching the city stretch endlessly beyond the river. The lights flickered like quiet applause from a world that didn't need to know the whole story. I thought about how far I'd come from that small apartment in Washington Heights, from the smell of hospital antiseptic and loneliness. Every step since then had been a reclamation, a reminder that power isn't loud and success isn't revenge. It's the steady decision to keep building when others expect you to crumble. A breeze passed through the terrace, carrying the faint sound of traffic below. I closed my eyes and smiled. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like isolation. It felt like ownership. My story no longer needed an audience to matter. Somewhere out there, Olivia was piecing herself back together. My parents were probably telling new versions of the past, ones that made them sound wiser, kinder. Maybe that was their own form of survival. I didn't begrudge them that. People rewrite history to make their mistakes bearable. I had no interest in correcting them anymore. The city glittered as if it knew something I didn't. Maybe it did. It had witnessed the entire arc, from fall to rise, from invisibility to command. And now, standing there in the quiet, I realized that I didn't crave another summit. I just wanted balance. When I finally went back inside, I left the doors open to the night air. My phone buzzed on the counter. Another missed call from my mother. I let it ring. Then I set it face down and smiled to myself. Some conversations belong to the past. What mattered now was what lay ahead. The companies we'd build, the people we'd lift, the stories we'd rewrite for the next generation of women who'd been underestimated. That was my legacy. Not the family who doubted me, but the one I was choosing to create. As I turned off the lights, the reflection of the skyline shimmered across the glass wall. My city, my proof. Quiet, powerful, and completely mine. Months passed after that night at the plaza, and the city returned to its familiar rhythm. The sound of ambition humming through steel and glass, the endless pulse of lives chasing meaning. For me, life settled into something quieter, steadier, though no less purposeful. The storm that had once surrounded my name had faded into background noise, replaced by what I had always wanted: peace, control, and the quiet satisfaction of having built a life that could stand on its own. The newspapers had stopped mentioning the engagement that never became a wedding. Family gossip had dulled to polite curiosity. At Stonebridge, business thrived. North River's transformation became a case study in half a dozen business journals. My team expanded the Rose Fellowship to new cities, helping women like I once was, overlooked, underestimated, hungry. And through it all, I found myself rediscovering something I'd almost forgotten: joy without permission. One evening, as twilight settled over Manhattan, I stayed late at the office. The building was nearly empty, the kind of stillness that turns a city into a sanctuary. I stood by the window, looking out at the lights reflected on the East River, and thought about the strange, winding road that had brought me here. From that cramped apartment in Washington Heights, to sleepless nights over spreadsheets, to that glittering ballroom where truth had finally taken its shape, it all felt impossibly far away and intimately close, as if every version of me was standing there at once. For years, I'd told myself I wanted revenge. That was the story I used to survive, the fantasy of one day returning to the world that had dismissed me, powerful enough to make them regret it. But standing there, watching the city glow beneath me, I realized revenge was far too small a word for what I'd built. The truth was simpler, deeper, cleaner. I hadn't destroyed anyone, I just refused to disappear. I remembered Grandma Rose's voice the night before she died. "Don't let them tell you what you're worth, sweetheart. Show them." Back then, I thought showing them meant proving something to people who never believed in me. But now I understood what she really meant. It was never about them. It was about me, about the strength it takes to keep believing in your own value when no one else does. About the grace to rise without bitterness, to succeed without needing applause. People like to romanticize revenge. They think it's fire, fast, bright, consuming. But real revenge, the kind that leaves an echo, is water. It moves slow, reshaping the landscape over time. It's the patience to outgrow those who underestimated you, and the wisdom to know that their opinion was never the measure of your worth. In the months after the party, my parents reached out again, cards at Christmas, a short letter from my father written in his careful, measured handwriting. He congratulated me on a recent award, wrote that he was proud of what I'd achieved. I read it twice and set it aside, not out of anger, but because closure sometimes looks like silence. Some relationships, no matter how old, can't be rebuilt from ashes. They can only be blessed from afar. Olivia, too, faded from the city's orbit. I heard she moved to San Francisco for a fresh start, though her name occasionally surfaced in conversations like a ghost slipping between stories. I didn't hate her anymore. Pity wasn't the right word either. What I felt was understanding. She had lived her whole life in a world that rewarded perfection. She never learned the art of starting over. I had. That was the difference between us. One morning, while reviewing proposals in my office, I came across a new partnership pitch for the Rose Fellowship, a collaboration with Columbia University. They wanted to fund scholarships for caregivers returning to school. I laughed quietly at the irony. The same institution I had once left behind now wanted to align itself with my work. Life, it seemed, had a sense of symmetry. I signed the papers immediately. That night, I visited Rose's grave for the first time in years. It was raining lightly, the kind of soft drizzle that feels more like a blessing than a burden. I laid a single white lily on the stone and whispered, "We did it, Grandma. You were right. I didn't need them to see me. I just needed to keep going." The words came easier than I expected, dissolving into the rain. On my way home, I thought about all the women I'd met through the fellowship: nurses, single mothers, widows, women rebuilding their lives one quiet victory at a time. They were my reflection, my legacy. They were proof that success is not a solo act, but a chorus of resilience passed from one hand to another. When I reached my apartment, I poured a glass of red wine and stood by the window, watching the city lights blur through the rain. Somewhere below, someone was probably chasing their own version of redemption, still believing that revenge was the destination. I wanted to tell them the secret I'd learned too late. Revenge is only the beginning. What matters most is who you become when you stop looking back. I thought about that night at the plaza, the glittering chandeliers, the stunned silence, the applause that had felt more like surrender than celebration. For years, I had imagined that moment as the pinnacle of victory. But now it felt like a chapter I had already outgrown. The real triumph wasn't in that room full of shocked faces. It was here, in this quiet apartment, surrounded by peace I had earned one hard lesson at a time. The world had finally seen what I was capable of, but the real satisfaction came from knowing I didn't need their gaze anymore. I was free. I sat on the couch, pulled out my notebook, the one I'd kept since my early days in business, and wrote a single line at the top of a blank page. The best revenge is not proving them wrong. It's becoming so whole that their opinions no longer define you. I closed the notebook, feeling something inside me settle, like dust after a long journey. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. I brewed coffee, reviewed reports, and watched the first light spill across the skyline. The city looked softer at dawn, its edges blurred, its noise not yet awake. For the first time, I didn't see it as something I had to conquer. I saw it as something that had shaped me, and that I had shaped in return. When people ask about my success now, I don't talk about strategy or profit. I talk about patience, about the years of silence, about choosing to keep showing up when no one's watching. Because that's what real revenge is, showing up over and over until you don't have to prove yourself anymore. Sometimes I still hear echoes of the past, a familiar name in a headline, a message from a cousin asking to reconnect. But they don't sting anymore. The hurt has turned into gratitude. Without their doubt, I might never have found my drive. Without their absence, I might never have learned self-trust. They had been the obstacle and the lesson. As the city came fully alive that morning, I whispered to myself, "You did it." Not with pride, but with peace. Because the real victory wasn't about being untouchable, it was about being whole. They called me the ugly dropout who'd never amount to anything. But I became something far better than what they imagined. Not untouchable, unbreakable. And that, I finally realized, was the only revenge worth having. Maya Bennett's story began with loss and ended with liberation. She was the family's forgotten daughter, the dropout no one believed in, the girl who walked away from a prestigious college to care for a dying grandmother. From the ashes of that rejection, she built something extraordinary. Not just a business empire, but an identity forged from resilience and purpose. Her climb wasn't glamorous. It was built on sleepless nights, broken pride, and a stubborn refusal to let others define her worth. Years later, when fate placed her back in front of the same family who dismissed her, Maya didn't arrive to destroy them. She arrived as living proof that silence can grow into strength, that dignity can outlast cruelty, and that the best revenge is transformation. Her story reminds us that we don't need to prove our value to people who refuse to see it. True success isn't about payback. It's about peace. The real victory comes when you can look back at those who doubted you and feel nothing but calm. In today's world, where comparison and judgment are louder than ever, Maya's journey teaches us to focus inward, to invest in our growth, our work, our healing, until our results speak louder than our wounds. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, remember this: your power is not in convincing others. It's in becoming someone who no longer needs to. Now, I want to ask you something. If you were in Maya's position, how would you handle your family's rejection after achieving success? A. Walk away quietly and live your life on your own terms. B. Return and show them what you've become. Comment your answer, A or B, below. And tell me, what do you think the real lesson in Maya's story is? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments so others can reflect with you. If you enjoyed this story and its message, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep creating powerful, emotional stories like this one.